Eric. So just a couple things, so you know that I'm not completely
Gord Perks and Scott Hubbard.
I did spend 20 years working as a community activist. One of the big things I worked on was public transit, so I have some biography there. I'm also, when MMM or somebody else does a big study, they recently did one on an alternative method of maintaining the gardener. I'm one of 2 city councillors that routinely they order an extra copy of all the appendices because I actually read them. Janet Davis is the other, by the way, so go Janet. Yes, it's true, not all of my colleagues delve into great detail about the technical stuff. And I'm not going to spend much time on the technical stuff because you've got technical people who can talk about it here. But I did want to start with one piece of good news. Here's a question for you. What is the largest civil engineering project in Canada today? Eglinton Crosstown. That's right. So it's not all bad news. It's not all bad news. We do make some progress. We limp and trip and get there eventually. The second thing that I want to do, I wish Eric could stay because I'd have a lovely debate with him. I'm going to ask you this question. How many people here are ideologues? No others? Okay, second question. How many people here think it would be a bad thing if Stephen Harper declared himself president for life and suspended elections indefinitely? Come on, really? Jim, really? Okay. All right. You can't have an opinion on the second question unless you have political ideas. We are all informed ideologically. The thing that's interesting in the way that we talk about politics in this country is we pretend we don't. We pretend the ideologues are the bad guys and that the rest of us just have something called common sense. The term common sense is very interesting to me. It was invented by a Marxist, an Italian Marxist. He was sitting in jail, Antonio Gramsci, if any of you are curious. He was sitting in jail while Mussolini was running Italy, wondering what the hell happened. And he came to this conclusion that politics is not just about all the things we usually think about it. It's actually a contest for what we call common sense. And the most dangerous thing is when we forget that it's a contest and we just allow people to tell us what is common sense. And forget that we have political ideas and let someone else tell us what is politics and call everything else ideology. So that's just one thing I'd like people to think about when they're in something like this. I want to turn next, and this is why I'm sad that Eric's not here, to something he said. We all had a good chuckle about chemotherapy and radiation. Well, here's a fact. We actually decide whether you get chemotherapy or radiation politically. We ration healthcare. There is not an infinite amount of money spent on treating cancer patients. When we decide what our tax rate will be, and we decide what our relationship between the federal government that manages the Canada Health Act and each of our provincial governments who actually deliver health services will be, we're determining what kind of treatment you will get when you get cancer. Right? It's political. Transit has always been political. There's a famous tale, Ed knows it better than I do, I'm sure, when they were building the original streetcar line up and down Yonge Street, the mayor of Toronto at one point, Toronto was much smaller at that point, ordered the Toronto police force out to stop construction because he didn't like the alignment. Transit has always been political. It's not. So, while it is very important that we understand the costs and benefits of what we're doing, while it is very important that we understand the relationship between density and our density goals and transit, and recognize that some forms of transit lend to density increasing and other forms of transit don't. And while it's important that we understand the built form that we build either will attract transit or not, and while it's important that we figure all of those things out, we must understand the political conversation that underlies why transit gets built or doesn't. It's a necessary part of the thing, and engineers need to understand it as well as everyone else. So there are a couple of political things going on right now that I wanted to share with you. I'm not going to talk about that man, because he's not very interesting politically, but I will talk about why he got elected. If you take a map of Toronto and look at the areas he won in a part of town which urban geographer from the University of Toronto, David Holchansky, is very interested in. You may have heard of the Three Cities Report. The Three Cities Report says Toronto used to have some areas of wealth, some areas of poverty, and a big area that was middle class with some poverty and some wealth in it. And over the last 30 years, that big area that was mixed in terms of its wealth and largely middle class has been shrinking and becoming increasingly lower income. There's been a real polarization. The interesting thing, by the way, for those of you who care about transit, is the wealthy areas tend to be accumulating along subway lines now. There's an interesting dynamic there. But what has happened is there are 1 million people or so in the city of Toronto who 20 years ago thought of themselves as middle class and now discover that they are low income. That happened to them for a bunch of reasons. One is globalization. An awful lot of manufacturing jobs vanished. And also a lot of middle management and even some engineering jobs. They all vanished. And went offshore. So what's happened is that work for those people who used to have good, reliable jobs in the manufacturing sector, or maybe they were vice president of a local bank branch, or had some kind of a steady, reliable income, have now got a lower paying job that's much more precarious. So all of a sudden, they can't make their mortgage payment. Sending their kids to a good school is out of their reach. The roof leaks and they can't save for it. They think they're middle class, but they can't afford to live a middle class lifestyle. And they're mad as hell. They're mad as hell. They think the system is broken and they think it's somebody's fault. Well, Margaret Thatcher isn't with us anymore, so we can't blame her. And globalization is very difficult to explain to someone when they're on their way to vote in a municipal election. So they blamed it on the previous administration, and the election before that, they blamed it on the administration before that. This plays out in terms of transit in a very specific way. Those areas feel that they are left behind. Another thing that you will know if you look at the Toronto political scene, if you ask people, is Toronto doing well, about 85% of them say yes. And then you ask, are you doing well? About 90% say no, not so much. They either say I'm not doing well, or they always have it in those 5 categories: not very well, not so well. So everyone is looking around thinking that everyone else is getting all the goodies. And that's really what's at heart now in debates over transit. People in Scarborough don't actually want a subway. They're not asking for a subway to be built there because they have any intention of riding it. They're doing it because they've been left behind economically, and something is causing that. Well, it must be that other people have subways and we don't. And we're being treated as second class. That's an important dynamic to remember. Another important dynamic to remember is that increasingly over the last 20 years, governments have been using the magic bean theory of public finance, whereby they argue that we don't have to pay for things the way we used to pay for things. We can pay for things in new and different ways, ways that don't cost you. We can use revenue tools. We can use public-private partnerships. We can use alternative financing mechanisms. You've all heard those terms discussed, right? You know what they mean? They mean nothing. They're just magic beans. We built the transit system we had using the income tax principally and property taxes, a smaller portion of it. Everything else is just a way of playing with the financing so that it gets pushed off to a later date, so that we can build now and your children will pay the taxes so that we later. So that dynamic is also at play, and people really believe that there is a revenue tool out there that prints money. They really believe that. So, with those political dynamics going on, it is very important, yes, that decision makers be informed about the transit benefits, but it's also important that all of us who care about the future of Toronto remember it's a political and ideological contest. We're trying an argument about the kind of city we want to live in. You have ideas about that. Whatever the evidence says, you have a responsibility to talk about your ideas as well. Secondly, we have to remember that incomes are moving like this for most people down, and a very small portion of people that are moving like that. And that income and wealth divide is creating a political crisis that is overshadowing all technical issues. So we have a responsibility to recognize that as society fragments economically like that, rational decision making is the first thing that goes out. So if you want rational decision making, part of what you have to do is fight to recreate the idea that we're all in it together. And finally, we have to be honest that things cost money. Any person who ever comes into my office and says, I want a new service, but doesn't come into my office and say, you should tax me and my neighbors to pay for that service, gets very short hearing. So if you want better transit, you have to also argue for higher taxes. There.
Just to keep moving along,